Okay, hello everyone. Welcome back after our short lunch break. So for this panel today at IGEC 2020, I'm really excited to talk about this because we're going to be talking about the problem that has especially surfaced in the last couple of years, what happens when esports teams run out of money. There have been professional sports teams, organizations investing so much money into these esports organizations, franchising, all of that. And, I think all of the panelists on today's panel have something to say about it. So without further ado, I'll just introduce them shortly and then they can talk about themselves for a little bit. So we do have Christopher Monte Cristo Michaels joining us, Barry Lee from Evolve Talent, and then Harris Peskin over at ESG Law. So why don't you guys go around and just talk about yourselves a little bit and introduce yourselves.
I'm a 15-year esports veteran. I'm currently the VP of brand at B-Site and commissioner of Flashpoint, the Counter-Strike League. I've provided commentary at a professional level in 7 different games. I've owned professional teams. I've coached professional teams. I've run journalism and owned journalism websites across the space. I've done basically everything except for be a pro gamer.
Yeah, the mechanics aren't good enough for that.
Hey, when I was 18, I was a semi-pro Warcraft 3 player, but I decided to pursue casting instead. Get out of here.
All right. So I'm Barry.
I'm the reason you're in esports, so shut up.
I don't say the reason, but formative part, I will agree. My name is Barry. I'm the director of esports at Evolve Talent Agency. Most of my job involves representing players in their contracts and then just in their careers. So yeah, that's really the long and short of it.
Hey guys, I'm Harris Peskin. I'm a partner over at ESG Law. I work with some other notable esports attorneys like Bryce and Krista, Bryce Blum, Krista Heiner. We represent a lot of professional esports teams, TSM, Team Liquid, Cloud9, basically doing everything from sponsorship deals, basic transaction deals, labor employment, intellectual property, some corporate stuff, tax stuff. We touch on basically all of it. So we get firsthand exposure to all of this, all of all the money stuff in esports. We see that basically happening. It all comes through our door. Generally speaking, if there is a form of revenue that's being generated by a company, we will usually have something to do with that in the form of like papering that, some sort of a transaction.
Perfect. So you guys cover a lot of bases, which I think is good for this panel because we're going to be basically covering all the aspects from player salaries to just overall team spending. And the first question that we need to address is just what do these teams spend this money on, this large sums that they are given that I feel like most of them have no idea what to do with. So we see stuff. Yes?
So first off, I want to address the fact that this panel is called What Happens When Esports Teams Run Out of Money, which I think is probably going to start happening potentially soon because of the current COVID-19 pandemic. A lot of teams, we don't really know the answer to this question because in what I would consider the modern esports era, which is 2012, post the rise of Twitch, we haven't seen that many collapses of orgs because basically the major orgs have all been tied to the rise of Twitch and the rise of video games. And so because the market has been increasing at such a rapid pace, they have been able to raise significant amounts of venture capital, and they always had another way to create another fundraise, basically. But now that the markets are no longer as good and a lot of marketing budgets and VC budgets have been frozen during the pandemic, we may find out what the answer to this question is, where we hadn't really had that opportunity in a big way before.
I think we've seen like a teaser of it with, I think almost like Infinite Esports, because like
Sure.
because I think Infinite Esports, Optic Gaming, formerly was it Houston Outlaws, formerly, and then we saw it when like their investors just pulled out, and then all their money essentially was frozen. So I think we saw a teaser of it, but that one was a little bit different how it ended up being resolved, because how do you say it? Like they just sold off all of their stuff to like kind of recoup a lot of the debts, and that might not be the case now with the pandemic. So Harris, I think I cut you off when you were about to say something.
It's fine. It's good. It's a good bet. It's just like a negotiation. Just kidding. So my answer or my take on the situation is that I don't think it's too different than other business analogs that we can draw. I think most of the time when a business is beginning to run out of money, they could do one of two things. They could cut expenses or they could raise money. In this situation, I think as it relates to raising money, you'll probably see reduced valuations. That's not necessarily too different than what we saw, at least in like the 70s, 80s, and even sports like basketball. Remember, in the 1990s, certain basketball games were being run on tape delay, so those markets all kind of weren't thriving at the time. Eventually, they would recover, but and blow up. But a lot of valuations were decreased, and a lot of people were selling for pennies on the dollars. Specifically, with my favorite team, the New York Islanders. That's one way we get through it. The other way is you look at a situation in which expenses need to be cut, and that I think is a more interesting dynamic, because that's something you could kind of control for within the industry itself. And I think that looks a little bit more like the market would obviously have to react to the financial realities of not being able to raise money. That means cutting player salary, cutting expenses, cutting staff. And in certain instances, you look at, like, for instance, what happened in the late 2010, or in the early parts of the late 2000, the decade of early 2010, in Europe, specifically the English Premier League. At the time, revenues were about equal to the amount of money, if not less than the amount of money that was being paid out to English Premier League players. And the response to that was to actually artificially limit the amount that could be paid out to professional players. And the interesting part here is that, given the fact that so much of the revenues of a team goes out to paying these players, it would seem almost necessary that the result would be to pay these players less money so that you could eventually avoid yourself from going belly up.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think we've kind of seen that, right? Like right now, because obviously, like the point you mentioned with the staffing cuts, right? Like, that's definitely happened. I've seen people let go from like a lot of, like, I guess, like higher level executives, and like just people that also just like staff that aren't needed. But also, like, we work with a ton of, like, at Evolve, we work with a ton of like Fortnite players, and like, players that aren't in like the franchise leagues as well. And a lot of those players have been getting cut, with the reason being like, budget among COVID, like being the reason. So like, it's definitely something that's already happening. And I think like you hit it kind of like on the head there.
Yeah, and I would say that even beyond just like, staff, I would say that the way that it looks and the way that it looked in 2004, 2005 is a good example with professional sports. And I know that a lot of people don't like to use professional sports as an analog, but it really does showcase what happens when a league is losing money and the players are deriving a huge portion of the amount of revenues that the teams are generating. What ends up happening in 2004 in the NHL is you have a lockout for an entire year, and when they come back from the lockout, there's a salary cap on these players, which is equivalent to 50% of the revenues generated by the league as a whole, right? And so that might be a path towards profitability. Obviously, it brings up some sorts of legal questions insofar as the question is, would that even be legal in the current structure that we have when you're not negotiating against a union, when you have a developer that's involved in negotiations as well? But I think that is a viable path forward, one that might actually become a necessity at some point, just to talk about the amount of money that the players are making right now. They're almost always and I would say that, in some instances, they're over 100% of the amount of revenue that a team is generating, and ultimately talking about what happens when a team runs out of money, right? And if most of the money is going to these players, then they need to cut back on those expenses. So I could see some sort of a protracted fight between, or over time, some sort of a disagreement between these players and these teams, just to figure out what is fair compensation in the marketplace, so that they don't continue to be a drain on these finances.
Yeah, I mean, um, uh, like I agree with your points, like mostly because I think you're totally right on the fact that like players, like teams, especially in the franchise leagues, like to kind of touch on like the franchise leagues, they they don't generate a lot of revenue because the league isn't generating revenue, and a lot of the franchise setups were kind of like were made with that assumption. So then all the money is like kind of the money that they like kind of the budget, the investments that they started with, and they're spending all the money. So like the revenue and the expenditures are probably like way out of whack. Like the balance, like the scales are completely unbalanced at the point. But the issue is, I think a lot of the teams they pay a lot of lip service to the fact that they want to reduce spending. There have been teams that just kind of like roll back onto like a lot of amateur players to really cut back on spending because they kind of want to kind of work. I think it's like whenever a team says we want younger players, it just means they want a roster, in my opinion. But at the same time, like there's always going to be a couple of teams that are kind of that end up driving the market because they are like they see everybody kind of scaling back on talent, and then they see it as this is our time to like kind of spend money and take over the league.
And
So
I think ultimately it goes down to what is the point of an esports team in the first place? Like, what are you doing in this business? I would tell you that from a professional sports perspective, generally, I don't think that most teams make money. I think most of them lose money. I mean, the valuation now at this point goes up, and so you could recoup. But when you sell your asset, you could take that money off the table. But I would say that most professional sports teams, or a lot of them at least, they probably don't make money. So if that's the point here, then what are we talking about in terms of how we're actually going to be able to generate this revenue in the first place? Is this something we want to continue to try to do? Are we going to reduce these player salaries? Are we going to really create these structures in place where we're concentrated? If we're esports teams, think about it from one of my clients' perspectives, right? Like, is their point to be the most competitive team in the world, to be the best team in the world? Is that the goal? Or is the goal to do exactly what you just said, to go ahead and bring a bunch of young players in, generate a fan base, create content, and monetize that content? Those are two separate goals, right? Because one of them is going to involve
disagree on that. Like
Sure.
that there's goals because winning is like the easiest way to build a brand or like get a lot of eyeballs on you is to win, right? So like
I don't know if I would say the easiest way.
well, let me put it like I meant more in terms of like causality rather than actually the act of winning. Well, like if you win, you generally get a lot more eyeballs on you. So like the logic behind
Yes, but tying
spending.
your brand to winning
Exactly.
is a huge mistake, because as soon as you stop winning, then you stop getting those eyeballs on you.
Correct.
And that is really, really difficult to do, and it doesn't engender any kind of long-term fan identity or fan loyalty.
Monty's 100% right here, and for what it's worth, he had the right idea with the Detroit Renegades, because when you look at what actually goes ahead and like generates you revenue, it's ultimately going to be fan attachment. You need to generate revenue from the people that care about your brand. So the question is, how do you create that fan attachment? So when Monty says, the strategy can't be just to pay the most money and put players out that can continuously win something, he's right. That could be short term, but it's not really creating long-term sustainable brand attachment. So what does in professional sports? It's a lot of it's regionality, to be honest with you. It's a connection to your region. In League of Legends, a lot of the time it's North America versus EU versus South Korea, what have you, right? But like on a more micro level, that could be based on cities. So you're trying to create these brand attachments. It doesn't necessarily, and it probably shouldn't, relate to spending the most money on players.
Oh no, like the point I was trying to make is that like a lot of teams kind of will spend the money to win in order to like build the brand and then like hopefully like use that as the base to like for the long-term goals. And it's extremely volatile because like it's a gamble, it's a risk. So instead of like kind of building the infrastructure, I think we've seen a lot of teams over the years that do that exact path where they just come in, spend a ton of money, and then try to build their brand along with at the same time. But the thing is like I think they do that in a situation where they don't have the proper org infrastructure, the proper staffing, the proper like kind of like the not protocols, but like at least like the workflow in order to make it really to capitalize on when they win, on building the brand when they win.
I think there's two kind of conversations here because there's multiple ways. It's not the same thing as when we discuss traditional sports, which is why this conversation is so weird. For a lot of reasons, the structure is not the same. Even in the franchise league, we don't have IP problems in traditional sports. And at the end of the day, traditional sports are all about creating the best sports product possible. The problem with having the developers in there is that they are engaging in a marketing exercise primarily, and their motivations around making the sports product a business have not always been there, because the developers, it's not their primary goal, but it is the team's primary goal, right? And the teams themselves, some of them, their primary business is being an esport, like an esports team in the traditional sports sense. And some teams, they have ancillary businesses that are their main revenue drivers. If you look at the difference between Cloud9, which is primarily an esports team, and TSM, which is primarily an advertising and website business, you see.
Right. And I wouldn't disagree that, you know, there are different aims. I think the point is, which is the more sustainable aim, right? The question really is, what is the one that works in the long-term future? Is it going to be that, you know, is it going to be the case that Cloud9 is always a super competitive team? I think you brought up this point too. Like, I'm not sure how sustainable it is. Whereas basically bringing yourself up, I don't want to say as a talent agency, because that might get me into legal problems, but what is in a sense a marketing arm for your sponsors, with, you know, being engaged by these sponsors to basically do your best job to promote them and then making use of your influencers. That might be a more sustainable business model than simply going ahead and performing in all these esports leagues, where you're right, Monty. The goals of the game developers do not always coincide with the goals of these teams. And so there's multiple ways to address that, right? At least in the context of what is the best way to address it from do we actually want to promote competition in these leagues? If you want to do that, then you need to make the goals align. That would probably be to say that the league should be self-sustaining on their own, and it shouldn't just be a marketing arm of these game developers. The teams should probably own these leagues at some point, so that the league itself, the mere fact that there is competition in these leagues that is, you know, compelling for people to watch, directly results in a benefit to these teams. So they're incentivized to create and further this competition. When you don't have that, when the developer derives everything, what I guess what I'm getting at is that incentive disappears. You're no longer incented to go ahead and create this super competitive team, because even if the league is going to be super successful, you might not necessarily see long-term benefits out of that, except to the extent that you remain successful.
I think that's why we've seen a market shift and like new players in the industry. Because a couple years back, like, you know, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, like even like 3 years ago, like, you know, when new teams come in, they always think like, you know, we're gonna be the sports franchise, we're gonna kind of set up as a competitive team. And now, like, when you see new teams come in, they kind of look at 100 Thieves is like a hybrid example, but I think they use like FaZe a lot as their benchmark on what an esports team is. And then it's more about like generating the content, having the fans like just kind of coalesce around like the FaZe the brand, rather than FaZe the esports, like, you know, entity.
Right.
So I think we're starting to see a shift in that direction, and I think people are still feeling out how exactly you make money off of that, because I think, like, because in the team esports and like the franchise perspective, like, you know, you want to sell against like all the games you play, but when you're looking at the content perspective, like the game is completely like the way you make money is completely different.
It's irrelevant.
Like,
yeah, exactly. And so what I would say actually is, just to kind of add on to that point, Barry, if you look at the most successful teams in terms of the brand of those teams, like if I were to say what are the most successful brands in esports right now that have fashioned themselves as esports teams, I'd probably say something like Cloud9, to Monty's point, is definitely one of them. I'd probably say Team Liquid is another one. And then I'd go and say, well, what about FaZe? What about 100 Thieves? What about TSM? Those are brands that right now aren't at the peak of, you know, competition in all the esports that they compete in, but they are the brands that are trying to churn out the most content and engage with their fans in a meaningful way. And they've and I think, as to the question that was initially put, how efficient are the teams with the way that they spend money, and what are they doing if they're running out of money? These guys are basically saying, we see the fact that we might run out of money if we can't maintain this strategy of being hyper competitive. We need to transition to a sustainable business model on its own, which is one in which we can provide value to third-party sponsors by making use of our influencers, not necessarily one in which we're hyper focused on being the most competitive brand at all times in every thing we ever do.
I think everyone's still like experimenting, right? Because I think people generally see the higher ROI in being more of a brand than a team, a competitive team. But I think like I think like on the team side, like for the exact flaws that you mentioned, the competitive team, like, you know, you have the developers being involved, you know, there's IP issues to like kind of weed out. So you have this kind of added barrier. Meanwhile, like if you're a brand, as long as you just pick up the right talent, then you can kind of maintain kind of like you're like much more nimble, I would say, like, because you like, you know, Fortnite's the latest thing. You find like the biggest, you know, sign some of like the guys that have like the biggest like eyeballs on the Fortnite side, and then you can kind of shift around a lot more easily because it's just there's not a whole team infrastructure you have to kind of dismantle in order to
I just hate this conversation because it's every team is not a sports team in the same way, right? Like we're talking about what would happen if the New York Yankees went out and signed someone from the Harlem Globetrotters to do tricks for them, and it was really popular. Like it's not a real competition. And so that's why I struggle so hard with categorizing these teams or trying to make equivalencies between all of them, because there are going to be teams that are only interested in truly competitive esports and are run in that traditional sports model. And then there are going to be teams that are basically, if you're FaZe, you're basically an influencer management content company with some esports teams grafted onto the side for reasons that, frankly, I don't even really understand. Like, if you asked me, why does FaZe have a CSGO team? I have no idea. Like, I have no idea why.
Hey, maybe their ownership has a soft spot for it.
So what I would say though is, Monty, it's actually, I think you're right, but I think it's an analysis. I think it's a really simplistic analysis at the end of the day, and the analysis comes down to what are the percentage of revenue, what percentages of teams' revenue comes from a certain spot, like where's the money actually come from, right? In traditional, you're right to say that it's not traditional sports, right? Because in traditional sports, a majority of a team's revenue is going to come from its broadcasting deal. It's going to have like roughly 50% of the money is going to come from broadcasting deal. You're then going to have maybe some from merchandise. And to be honest, no esports team has really done a good job making any form of money off of merchandise, absent maybe 100 Thieves, which seems to be trying to do a good job. But I'm not even sure I would give it to them right now.
No.
My favorite is still the MS Paint 100
right.
block. Like...
So then if it's 50 plus 10 on merchandise, and then you maybe have 20% probably on ticket sales, those don't exist either. So you're already taking out broadcasting, you're taking out ticket sales. The remaining percentage that you would have there is probably around 30% for sponsorship money. That is really the primary form of revenue that a team has available to it. So then you ask yourself, when we say what's different between this and traditional sports, well, the traditional sports, you're incentivized to get money from broadcasting, which means eyes watching competitive products, as well as ticket sales, people attending your games. Since that doesn't exist here, the esports teams are solely incentivized to make money off of sponsorships. And what a sponsorship really is eyes on the product for the sponsor. They don't care why those eyes are on the product. They just want to make sure that people are actually paying attention to their product. And so that's what brings us back to this initial point. Because those traditional revenue streams aren't available for a professional esports team, they're less incentivized to care about fielding a competitive product. And I don't disagree with you. I think it's completely silly that is the result. That just so happens to be the world in which we're living.
Well, I think it's really interesting. It's really funny more than interesting that if you look at like some of the franchise leagues, like there's no like actual monetary benefit to making playoffs or like, you know, going all the way to finals. Like, because if you look at traditional sports, you get a cut of that kind of like the broadcasting dollars and playoff structure, right? So it's like you're incentivized to field a competitive team to make it to playoffs, and then so you get a bigger cut of the pie. But the thing is, in esports, you don't have that. Like, you know, LCS team reaches playoffs, reaches finals. It's like they earn roughly the same amount. Maybe they can sell like against sponsorships and like extra like merch or stuff like that, but it's like not the same amount of money like these traditional sports teams make when they make playoff into the postseason.
So to be fair, though, I think that certain leagues have done a better job at trying to realign those interests in a way that is, you know, it's intelligent, right? You look at leagues that are attempting to emulate a model that is fully owned by the teams, where there's then an incentive to go ahead and create interest in that league.
Oh, who could be doing that?
Right.
I wonder.
Who's doing that? Like that exactly. Monty's right. Obviously, he's, you know, but the point is that's the intelligence structure.
Don't tell Monty he's right. He gets his head becomes bigger, bigger.
Monty's generally right. He's right about a lot of things. But yeah, but when he and other leagues, to be fair, like League of Legends, like or LCS rather, they're trying to in some way with the revenue structure that they've implemented with the rev shares, it tries to emulate that as well. It's just, these barriers still exist. We haven't broken through these barriers, and because of the lack of viability of these leagues on their own, the fact that they might not be generating as much of a profit as they otherwise should, teams have in fact been forced to look to other paths to monetization, which just really involve being, like Monty said, a talent management company at some point.
Well, I feel like even when they're given these opportunities or given these players that are going to cost a heavy price, they don't do anything with it. They just have no marketing backup. For example, the biggest thing that I can think of off the top of my head was when Dignitas picked up Huni for that huge contract and then did absolutely nothing with it. They barely used Huni in his marketing. They didn't use him as the face of the brand at all, and they didn't do anything with it. And now he's gone, and all that money.
Yeah, I think you're totally right. And I think the flaw there is this thinking. So the alleged value of Huni's annual contract to Dignitas was $1.2 million. So we have to ask ourselves a question. Does paying Huni $1.2 million result in Dignitas making $1.2 million or more dollars back?
Right.
And like, are you going to sell enough Huni jerseys that makes sense? No. Is the answer
hey,
no?
Hey,
so
you didn't see the secret marketing documents that had that come up with.
I don't think they signed any sponsors for that value that were like, the tipping point was having Huni. Like, I just don't believe that conversation or that scenario ever existed. Yeah. So I agree with you, and I think that teams, but at the same time, you can't 100% look at it as the path to profitability right now, because that would be like saying that we should have considered in sports past. Now you have to remember that sports teams themselves, as Harris alluded to earlier, many of them do not make a significant profit. So the question is, why are these things worth billions of dollars? And the answer is, it's a scarcity market, and there are a bunch of super rich people that want a shiny toy. So if you are a super rich person,
esports.
if you are a super rich person who wants a shiny toy, then maybe you do pay people millions of dollars because it's your shiny toy, and that's what you do to have fun with your money. Or if you are a team in esports right now, maybe signing Huni, even though it's a little different with Dignitas because they're owned by Harris Blitzer, which is literally a sports team. Like they own the Devils and Crystal Palace and
76ers.
And a lot of I think it's a lot of restaurants. I think in that case, it's a little bit different. But for many teams that may be looking in the long term to sell, having the prestigious players that they overpay in the short term could, in theory, be an exit strategy of selling for a crap ton of money in the long term. So it's not necessarily bad that they're doing that right now.
Well, so you're talking about in terms of creating a legacy, right? Like,
well, that's based on an assumption, though, is that the valuation will continue to go up based on the scarcity and people wanting to buy these shiny toys, which might not be the case in a world in which, one, people realize that these teams don't actually make money, because a lot of the times when you look at the valuations of these brands, they're being valued at like tech startup levels, like with 10x multipliers, which is just ridiculous in my opinion. And two, like you're looking at it from the perspective of, hey, the current pandemic is not going to go ahead and influence, future profitability or future interest in buying these teams. So I would say that correct. It might be worth paying him 1.2 in the event that you were to say, it's because we could recoup that when we go and we try to exit. But the reality is, no one really knows what the exit looks like right now because it's such a complicated marketplace.
Yeah, and also you can't know what the exit looks like because you don't know when the exit's coming, and so you don't know, therefore, which franchises are valuable. And considering we've had in the space turnover of esports on a much more rapid basis due to evolving technology and new releases of games, like we haven't had giant sports turnover takes decades for things to rise and fall. Esports goes much faster than that. Right. So it is a highly dangerous and volatile space to be in, I think, from the team perspective. But obviously, the potential payout is enormous.
The funny thing is, like, a lot of the teams over the years that have bought in and then sold, like, they usually, like, yeah, the team kind of crashes and burns, but then they sell, like, the spots, they sell their assets, and they usually come out ahead, like, at least in terms of, like, what they put in initially, right?
For now.
But, like, for now.
What happens? What happens when the value of one of those franchise slots decreases? That's
what
the
I'm
danger.
saying is that, like, that's been the case so far, because, like, the valuations have been, like, the people looking in is like, I want to buy in now, and they kind of buy into these, like, higher valuations. So I think it really goes to the point of, like, what happens when the valuation crashes, right? Like, so, like, it's like, I don't know if we're gonna see it, like, right away, but, like, maybe in the next 3 years, we're definitely going to see more case studies of this.
Right, and that's why I caveated at the beginning with, I said that there's two things that can happen in this. You seek outside investment is one, because I think the initial question is what happens when a team runs out of money, right? The first thing I said is you seek outside investment and you try to sell, right? If that's not available, then you need to look internally and you need to cut so you can continue running a business. And that, I think, is ultimately what ends up happening here. I don't actually know the way in which that happens, given, and I know this might come across the wrong way, but I think Hal actually said it well in his interview with Monty recently. Players have it pretty well right now in esports, from my perspective. I know that there's a lot of people that like to talk about how they don't have it too well. They're signing all these contracts. The reality is there's pretty much a standard form contract at this point. That it's not a CBA with like a 2-page contract. It's just a standard form contract that basically all the teams use. It's been edited down to death by a lot of player agents in this space. And in terms of the money they're making, it's far in excess of the amount of money that they would otherwise be making if we were using traditional traditional salary cap formulas that are used in other professional sports. So there's really not that much incentive for them to, change everything up. And that might just result in, if they're not willing to change everything up, if we're not willing to somehow figure out a way in which we can restrict the teams from eating themselves, in a sense, they might just eat themselves. They might just go out of business.
At the end of the day, it's like, people say, like, players have it well, like, and then players are getting paid too much. But, like, at the end of the day, who's paying these players, right? It's like,
right.
Like, when Team Liquid came out with that roster in 2017, like, people were, like, flabbergasted by, like, the kind of, like, the amounts they were hearing in terms of salaries. And if they hadn't won, because if you remember, if, like, they entered, like, playoffs in 4th or 5th place, and, like, there was, like, this big mid-season panic, and, like, people forget about that in the initial spring split. But then the thing is, they won, so everyone kind of is like, oh yeah, it makes sense, they spent money and they won. But, like, if they hadn't won, like, the market would have just gone back to being where it is. Well, like, Team Liquid winning was probably the worst thing to happen to a lot of LCS teams, I feel like.
It's actually an incredibly interesting point, because the result in what we're kind of talking about is almost the same exact result that we saw in the English Premier League. So in that league in the 1990s, they basically reformed, and since 1992, only 6 professional teams have won the English Premier League in however many years that is. It's almost 30 years at this point. The reason is because there's only so many teams that can afford financially themselves to make these payments to these teams based off the amount of money that they're generating. And so they are the ones that are able to really pump up these massive salary numbers, and all the teams at the bottom that don't have that investment, since there's restriction on who could take investment in the English Premier League, and they don't have the money coming in the form of sponsorships, broadcasting, or whatever, they're forced to pay the lesser payable players. So what you get is a complete lack of parity in these leagues. And that's almost exactly the situation that we're seeing with a lot of these professional esports teams. When you look at the LCS, for example, how many teams have won the LCS? I mean,
it's like a very small handful. It's CL, GTS, and Cloud9 TL. That's it.
LEC. What about the LEC, right?
It's like G2 and Fnatic for the last, like, 10 or 12 seasons, right. I think.
Right. Alliance won once, but right.
Oh, yeah. Never forget.
Right, but basically, it's the lack of parity in these leagues is so small. There's basically no parity whatsoever, just because the teams at the top could continue to, based on the amount of money that's so concentrated in them, they could continue to dole this cash out. But unless these other teams at the bottom are going to make a short-term play on taking investment and then putting that all back into money to do exactly what you just said, Barry, which is probably not a good long-term strategy, they can't really survive.
Well, then I think it poses a question. Do you guys ever see a future where there's salary caps on player salaries? Is that ever something that you think will happen?
I think in like LCS or like League of Legends or even like Overwatch has like a soft cap. But the thing is, like, it has to be based off of the revenue that the league and like the kind of the whole competition as a whole is generating. And until there's like some sizable amount, I don't know if there's like going to be actual like spending cap discussions, especially in League of Legends. Not yet, I think, because there's no point in saying like, you know, the cap is going to be an X amount of dollars because it is a percentage of the revenue, because there needs to be revenue first
Yeah.
for them to make that kind of make that well as a division.
So I think that the answer to that question also depends in large part on the appetite of the players to prevent the owners from eating themselves. Because right now, in America at least, the owners cannot legally impose a salary cap on the players. That would be a violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act. It would basically be a restriction on competition. The only way that that could ever happen would be if the players were to unionize and thereby forego their ability to file a claim for the violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act based on the non-statutory labor exemption that they are granted, that the leagues are actually granted when they go ahead and are negotiating with a union. So because the players probably don't have an appetite for unionization right now, since they're getting everything that's basically being handed to them, they're completely disincentivized from, you know, forming a union, which would otherwise permit the owners to go ahead and impose some sort of a salary cap. So the interests are completely out of line, which is why I'm saying I think a lot of the business models that you're seeing from these teams are acknowledging that and moving away from a traditional competition model and more towards an influencer kind of model, which has its own legal problems. But yeah,
I mean, everything has its own legal, like none of it's been litigated or like kind of like set in stone. Like there's no regulatory body to like enforce anything. So it's like that, like it's everyone's like, oh yeah, esport, the Wild West of esports over. It's like, I think we've just like, it's still getting started, man. Like we still haven't figured out a lot of like how traditional entertainment laws kind of like jive with what's happening in esports, because there are applications, it's just no one's really applied them.
right.
See, I feel like we keep talking about these unknown territories or these things that we're still experimenting on. And esports has been around for, you know, a couple, like almost like a couple decades at this point. And so, you know, it's not necessarily like fresh out of the oven, but we have established some kind of base. But as Monty was saying earlier, we move faster than traditional sports. This is something that is rapidly evolving. Are we going too slow? And is that going to catch up to us? And bring us back to the point, are we going to run out of money with these organizations because we just don't know what to do? And how can we prevent that?
I think like we saw a lot of like continued growth in esports just because the economy was growing at the same time. Like, you know, between 2010 to like 2019, just before COVID hit, it's just been continual upticks, right? It's just been going up and up year over year. So more people were just like willing to like, they had more money to like kind of throw around to like make like outside bets and stuff like that. If the economy shrinks and we hit a recession point, like it's a question, because like I think like in 2000, a lot of people, like I've been talking with this like a couple people, and like in 2008, like when the recession hit, like sports viewership was apparently pretty great during 2008, because a lot of people weren't.
It was a huge driver in the creation of the streaming culture in esports as well. Historically, during recessions, in fact, I mean, you should know this, Barry. Korean esports was basically created as a result of the Asian economic crisis in 1998. Yep. And the reason why that is that there were a bunch of people who were out of work, who were at the PC bongs in Korea playing video games, and that's where StarCraft Brood War started going on TV and becoming ultra popular. And in the same way, in the recession in 2008, 2009, you have to remember that this was the start of what we would consider the modern esports era, that coincided with the launch of StarCraft 2, that coincided with the rise of MLG and IPL and these major tournaments. Because here's what it is. It's free entertainment. It's free that you can watch online. And, you know, Own3D and Twitch at the time were the competing streaming platforms, and they were exploding in terms of viewership. And the thing is, video games are always great value, especially today when games are free to play. By the way, guess what else came out in 2009? League of Legends. You think that League of Legends that came out in October of 2009 had nothing, like the rise of that game had nothing to do with it being free to play during an economic recession? Like, it was huge.
Because the competing thing, like, because Dota 2 wasn't out yet, so the competing thing was Heroes of New Earth, and that had like a $30 barrier to entry at the I remember. And a lot of people didn't want to spend that $30 because a lot of my friends were starving college students, so they just play League of Legends because it was free. So
Yeah, I think that generally the point stands. I think that recessions might not affect, and even right now, you just look at the fact that we're all cooped up inside. The year over year viewership on Twitch has actually increased as well.
It was like 90% March to March or something.
Right,
well, that's
right.
the funny thing. It's like CDL viewership has been awful, though. Like in light of all this.
Well, that's the point, right? Like it really comes down to are you trying to fit a square into a round hole in some sense, right? Like are you trying to force, I don't want to say competitive esports on everybody? Is what is really attractive here to the masses? Is it the entertainment value of just, this is the new way in which influencers are going to exist. They're going to exist as streamers on a platform and when they're playing games and talking to their audience. Or is the value in, watching people at the highest level of competition? And honestly, I don't know the answer to that question.
I think there will always be an appetite for like watching people at the highest level like compete against each other, just because, you see it and you think like, oh, I can do that in my own game. But at the same time, like I think there's always going to be appetite. It's like appetite for it, but will it be the pinnacle of like, gaming entertainment? Like it isn't even the pinnacle gaming entertainment right now.
Right. Well, that's the point, right? It's not even the pinnacle of gaming entertainment right now by a long shot, for what it's worth. And on top of that, if it's not, that spells some not so great news for teams in the not too distant future. Which means that they would probably drastically need to rethink how they're doing business, and that might in fact be kind of already what we've seen, and kind of an adjustment to the times.
I personally feel like there's a lot of people try to pass the buck onto other people, esports, like in the franchise league, I saw it in Overwatch. I kind of see it now in LCS and at least a little less right now, but in LCS, people are the teams are really leaning on the league and the production to really kind of make the product better, attract more viewers, but then the teams don't necessarily really do anything to drive fan engagement and interest, because at the end of the day, fans are fans of stories of players, of what happens around the competition rather than how it's presented. So the presentation has a large does play a large part in it. But
I agree with that, to be honest.
I just see the vast majority of teams just really lean on the leagues and the production rather than kind of going out and trying to build things
Well, I think that they're all important, but if we're looking at fans in esports, I used to help run a team back in the day, and
that had no fans.
That had no fans, right?
They were very hard to kill, I heard.
So in any event, I helped run a team, but the important thing is that my experience in running the team was that a lot of our fans were actually based out of the places where the players came from. So in other words, if we had a Polish player on our team, we had a lot of we had a lot of Polish fans. But that's not sustainable either, because again, that's talking about regionality. There's a connection here that draws you to a piece of laundry. It's the regionality of where that laundry comes from, right? But when that player leaves, what happens to the fans from that region? They just leave? They just go?
They follow the player.
But that again, but the prospect of creating compelling story, and basically that being a draw for the brands itself is not. It kind of falls on deaf ears in my eyes. I think that really what's happening here is
I think that producers are just super bad at driving narratives in esports.
That could be too.
That's fair too.
Yeah.
I think that the actual just production sucks. That's what I think.
I think that the production is definitely bad at the same time. I think that both of them could definitely use a big boost, and I think that I think that at the end of the day, I don't know. I'm not attracted to a specific brand just because of the name of the brand, right? I don't know why I use certain. I'm not married to any specific product that I use unless it's a good product. The brand doesn't really do anything for me. But I am a huge New York Islanders fan, and the reason is because they basically represent my home city. So that's kind of the way I've always looked at these kinds of things.
Well, that's what CDL and Overwatch League were trying to tap into, right? Because I definitely had a friend who was like, "Oh, Boston has a team. I guess I'm gonna hate the New York team," and then just it kind of that's what they said, and they kind of initially started watching, but then that interest fell off a cliff.
Well, I mean, you're trying to do it with games that aren't the most popular games, right? I think that for what it's worth, and I live in New York, and I can tell you, I would regularly go out to like fan viewing parties for the NYXL, right? Like, and there were people there. There were like a significant amount of fans there. They cared. Like the Deadly Venoms, they're an established fan base in this spot, and like I think they were actually able to grow it at a grassroots level and create some sort of fan loyalty to their product. The problem is that, well, one, they were really one of the only ones that were able to do it very well, and two, like the game just isn't that popular, in my opinion.
Well, unfortunately, 45 minutes have passed somehow, but I just want to give you guys his last minute thoughts on just overall. I mean, obviously we can't really conceptualize this into one sentence, but at least something to sum it up, so maybe people out there would listen and hopefully move towards better financial spending.
I think that the best way that teams can spend money right now is on, I know we alluded to this many times, but I think every single organization in esports could use some rebranding. And by that, I mean, like, a lot of these teams, for example, Team Liquid, came out of a website. It was a community website that turned into an esports team as they started sponsoring players. And they're called Team Liquid, but they have a horse as their logo because you would have to know, you'd have to be OG like me to know that they originally had horses on the header of the website.
And they hated League of Legends.
Yeah, well, yes, that was a different problem that they had. They had a lot of problems, but you know, I love their community feel as a team. But my point is that over time, a lot of these teams just sort of randomly mutated in terms of their brand as they were trying to figure out what was going on. TSM started as a guide site, and it was an advertisement for their League of Legends guides, which was solomid.net. So it was the team of solomid.net. And I think it would behoove many teams, every team, to go back to the drawing board and say, what are our brand values right now? What does it mean to be this X team, TSM, Liquid, whatever, Cloud9, and say, how are we going to rebrand and align everything for us in terms of strategy and in terms of aesthetic and in terms of presentation for the future? Because everything has moved so fast, nobody has properly reevaluated their position in the market. And I think that is something that should happen and is the best use of money that you could have right now, is to get a major branding agency to help you with that.
Couldn't agree more.
I think for me, I think teams just need to, like, the rebranding is a good idea, but I think they also just need to look kind of internally on what the priorities are, because I think a lot of teams don't really understand where their priorities are, what they need to do or what they want to do. They just have this mishmash of things that they're trying to accomplish at the same time. So they need to really, like, I think, structure their development and create like longer term plans than just like a 1 or 2 year plan on we're going to win and build a brand around it. It's like, I think they need to figure out their infrastructure. Is like, this is mainly towards new teams, but they need to figure out the infrastructure and then prioritize based off of that plan.
I'll end it and say, in the event that spending dries up in the form of capital that's being generated or that's being given to these teams, I would say that teams need to drastically rethink the amount of money and the allocation of money they're spending on players, and they would need to get creative in terms of what their future, if they're going to continue to exist as a business, looks like. I think we've seen certain teams do that. I think that since almost the entirety of these teams' revenues generates from sponsorships, I think that that model might become more emulated across the entire industry at a certain point. Not to say that that's the correct model. The other alternative is that leagues need to begin to give more money to these teams, or need to be able to make more favorable revenue sharing goals for these teams to align the interests as they originally were.
Or I would argue not just about revenue sharing, but actually have a goal of profitability instead of being an advertising wing for the main game itself, because that is something that has been a problem across the industry for many years now.
Right. Yeah. And that's something that, and I don't want to take up more time, Kelsey, but that's something that generally goes untalked about. But that is, in my opinion, one of the biggest problems, is that for the longest time, these leagues existed as a marketing arm of a game to continue to bring in value. Yes. And these teams were kind of treated for an incredibly long time. I'm talking like 6-7 years before that we really saw significant change. They were treated essentially as they were going to be doing the marketing for these leagues, and you should be so lucky to be involved in them. I think that's changed in large part, but I think that we still have a ways to go.
Yeah, I know. We can honestly talk about this for hours, and I would love to. But thank you guys so much for taking part of this panel. I know everyone really appreciates your thoughts on everything. Up next, we do have our keynote with Joe Marsh from T1 and Jacob Wolf, so stay tuned for that. Thanks.
Right.